What really happened after dark in the streets of Victorian London? Behind the gaslit alleys and elegant facades, a hidden world pulsed with vice, pleasure, and rebellion. This wasn't the London of top hats and tea. This was the underbelly, a realm ruled by the forgotten, the forbidden, and the fearless. From secret brothels and underground opium dens to cross-dressing clubs and black market rituals, this is the tale the history books dared not tell. Stay until the final chapter, because the darkest secret of all was hidden in plain sight. But before we dive in, let me know if you're enjoying this kind of long, gentle history. Feel free to tap that like button and subscribe, only if you truly love what I'm doing here. And in the comments, share where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your city. I always love seeing our little bedtime crew gathering from every corner of the world. Now lower your lights, maybe let a soft fan hum in the background, and settle in. Let's ease into tonight's quiet journey together. Chapter 1: Gaslight and Shadows, London After Dark. When the sun sank below the soot-stained rooftops of Victorian London, the city seemed to hold its breath. The rattle of carriage wheels slowed. The chatter of factory smoke and market stalls gave way to something more uncertain. In the polished neighborhoods of Kensington and Belgravia, curtains were drawn tight and lamps glowed behind frosted windows. But elsewhere, in the veins of the city few dared to trace, another London stirred. A London that only came alive when the light died. As gas lamps flickered to life one by one, casting halos on the fog-choked air, the shadows grew deeper, and so did the secrets. The cobblestone streets, uneven and slick with filth, began to hum with footsteps not heard in daylight. This was the hour of the forgotten, the hour when rules bent and masks slipped. And if you knew where to look, you'd find a world stitched beneath the surface, alive, unruly, and bound by silence. Down the winding alleys of Whitechapel and Lambeth, life after dark was anything but quiet. It began slowly, like a low rumble, muffled laughter in the corners, rustling cloth behind tattered curtains, a soft knock on the wrong door. The city's laboring poor, who worked until exhaustion by day, transformed at night, not into villains or vagrants, but into survivors. The cabmen who ferried London's elite by day now carried secrets instead. Drunken lords, bloodied fists, girls who never gave their real names. They knew every shortcut, every alley where a deal could be made or a debt collected. Then there were the match girls, walking barefoot through the grime, their fingers yellowed by phosphorus, hawking boxes door to door with practiced charm. They moved like shadows, silent, quick, invisible. And yet, the night was their ally, granting them a power daylight never allowed. Further still, near the Thames where the river groaned like a restless beast, chimney sweeps gathered around low fires. Boys barely tall enough to reach a man's waist, blackened with soot and silence, shared crusts of bread while watching the city flicker around them. For them, nighttime was not a pause, it was a freedom. No overseers to scream, no masters to strike. They stole through houses to warm their limbs or find scraps. No one looked twice at a smudge-faced child ducking into a coal cellar. They were phantoms, tolerated as long as they stayed quiet. Nearby, the docks swelled with movement. Sailors stumbled off ships, dragging behind them tales of foreign ports and pockets full of strange currency. Traders haggled by lantern light, their goods covered in cloth. sometimes silks, sometimes opium, sometimes worse. The boundaries between trade and crime blurred in the night mist, and nobody asked questions they didn't want answered. By contrast, the wealthy districts remained eerily still. Horse-drawn carriages rolled soundlessly over manicured roads, delivering gentlemen to unseen destinations. The homes of the aristocracy loomed like tombs, majestic but cold. Servants lit candles and retired to cramped quarters beneath the floorboards, where hushed voices and stolen glances replaced the rigid formality of daylight. Here, too, the night offered a different face. Footmen whispered forbidden jokes, maids slipped upstairs in the dark, and secrets passed hand to hand like coins. Even the cleanest homes had corners where the gaslight could not reach. And behind those corners, even lords and ladies bent the rules. In drawing rooms left dim on purpose, strange gatherings took place. Cards were played, liquor flowed, and eyes wandered dangerously. The elite thought themselves hidden, but the night saw everything. As darkness deepened, the flickering gaslights played tricks on the mind. A shadow might be a man or a stray dog. A whisper might be laughter or a warning. London's labyrinthine layout fed this uncertainty. Streets twisted back on themselves. Rows of houses shared walls and secrets. Entire lanes disappeared when fog rolled in. It was easy to get lost if you didn't know the scent of the butcher, the scrape of the bootmaker, or the call of the lamplighter. And for the shadow class, that was exactly how they survived. They memorized the rhythms, the hour when the bobbies turned their rounds, the knock that meant danger, the scent that meant death. Many had no addresses, no names, only patterns. They moved with the instinct of prey, but also with the cleverness of those who had nothing left to lose. Some worked all through the night. The mudlarks combed the filthy edges of the Thames, seeking coins, nails, teeth, anything that could be sold. Their hands were blistered, their eyes trained to glint. Others, like the costermongers, peddled cheap wares until dawn. Cracked fruit, old meat, tin jewelry. They sang loud to cover up the hunger. At times they gathered in clusters, shouting to draw crowds or frighten off pickpockets. Many were children, left to survive however they could. Their laughter was brittle, their bodies small, but their minds were sharp. In dark corners, they played games that mimicked life, trading, stealing, escaping. It was not innocence. It was rehearsal, and the streets watched and taught and punished. But danger was never far. Nightfall did not soften the cruelty of the city. It masked it. In unlit alleyways, debt collectors worked with fists. Rival gangs carved out turf with blades hidden in belts. A single scream could vanish into the fog, never to be traced. The police, when they came, often came too late or not at all. In many slums, they were seen not as protectors but as predators in uniform. Bribes were common. Blind eyes even more so. Protection cost money and most had none. Instead, they relied on whispers, on codes scratched into walls, on dogs that barked too soon. Some carried knives. Others carried nothing but their reputation. The night was a test, and only those who understood its language made it to morning. Yet there was beauty too. Amid the grime and hardship, music drifted from upstairs windows. Street performers twirled fire in open squares. Lovers met beneath broken archways. The night did not ask for decorum. It did not care if your boots were torn or your hands unwashed. It allowed joy in stolen moments. Dancers swayed to invisible tunes. Children climbed rooftops to watch the stars fight through the smoke. Even in poverty, people found ways to feel alive. The city pulsed with contradictions, desperation and defiance, silence and song. It was a rhythm only the nighttime knew, and those who lived it could never forget its beat. The duality of London, the polished facade and the festering underbelly, was never more clear than after dusk. The same gaslight that glowed warmly in a parlor cast terrifying shadows in an alley. The same fog that lent romance to a garden walk made corpses disappear by the river. Every story had two sides. A maid could be a thief, a beggar, an informant, a gentleman, a predator. Identities blurred. Masks slipped on more easily in the dark, and sometimes they stayed on until morning. To survive, people learned to perform, to smile when afraid, to disappear when necessary. The night demanded cleverness, and in return it offered something like freedom, however brief. The carriages that rumbled through the city at night often carried passengers with nowhere to go. Some fled scandal, others sought pleasure or pain. Many simply wanted to vanish for a few hours. Drivers rarely asked questions. They had seen too much. A woman in a veil, a man with trembling hands, a boy who refused to speak. The city was full of stories, and the night was where they unfolded. Behind every shutter, behind every unmarked door, lives unraveled and rewrote themselves. Sometimes they ended, other times they simply transformed. The night erased titles and dirted cuffs. It made everyone equal under shadow, and so the cycle repeated. Each night, London changed its face. The gaslights flickered, the fog crept in, and the streets filled with ghosts of the living. The elite retreated into illusions. The poor stepped into a brutal kind of freedom. Between them, a current of unspoken understanding moved, never acknowledged, but always there. This was the secret heartbeat of the city, not found in palaces or parliament, but in the stolen hours between dusk and dawn. A world hidden in plain sight, and as one night died and another prepared to rise, the true rulers of London, the shadow class, faded once again into the alleys, waiting for the gaslight to glow. Chapter 2. The Crimson Mile, Hidden Brothels and Fallen Women. When the lamps dimmed in Soho and Clerkenwell, a different kind of trade began to stir. It did not announce itself with signs or grand displays, yet it thrived with more consistency than many legal professions. Behind velvet curtains, wooden shutters, and ordinary doors that looked like any others, London's underworld of sex quietly prepared for the night. There was no single face to it. Some women stood under gaslights with painted lips and practiced smiles. Others waited behind heavy doors, visible only to those who knew which knock to use. The brothel was not just a house. It was a system, a language, a city within a city. For the women trapped in it, it was survival bought hour by hour. For the men who visited, it was escape, dominance, or sometimes just company. The line between victim and merchant blurred. In this world, respectability did not matter. Only secrecy did. Most brothels were hidden in plain sight, nestled between bookshops, tailors, and bakeries. A respectable-looking townhouse could house 10 women on 3 floors, each one a different price, a different specialty. The madams who ran these dens were often sharper than the businessmen who came calling. They handled bribes, timed appointments, and knew the weaknesses of every inspector and politician who visited. Some madams had once been working girls themselves. Others had never lifted a skirt but understood human desire better than any preacher. They did not wear lace, they wore control. Beneath them were hierarchies of women, divided by appearance, experience, and favor. Some were young and terrified. Others were older and had mastered the art of performance so well it was hard to tell where the mask ended. Each woman had her story. None were simple, but few were ever told. At street level, signals guided the discreet. A red scarf tied to a railing. A candle left burning in a second-floor window. Men would walk past 3 times before knocking, always pretending to be lost or looking for someone else. The brothel door opened silently. No words exchanged, just a glance, a coin, and an unspoken understanding. Inside, the air was thick with perfume and desperation. There was music sometimes, soft and slow, often played by a girl who never looked up. The rooms were small, barely lit, and cold. Mirrors were cracked, beds creaked. Time moved differently here. Some visits were over in minutes. Others stretched for hours, as if the outside world no longer mattered. In these rooms, secrets changed hands more often than money. Some clients returned again and again, not for lust, but to confess, to cry, to forget who they were outside that door. Not every encounter was paid for in coin. Sometimes it was paid in favors. A constable who agreed to look the other way. A judge who dismissed a case. A landlord who kept the rent low in exchange for silence. Women learned quickly how to trade survival. The cleverest brothels had client lists written in code. Names were never used, only initials, habits, and odd details. They knew who liked to be watched, who feared being seen, and who could not risk discovery. Many of the city's most powerful men passed through these doors, pretending to be someone else for just one night. But they were always themselves, truly, in those moments. And the women remembered. They kept mental ledgers. Not just for protection, but for leverage. In a world where everything was taken from them, secrets became their currency. The lower end of the trade, however, was far more brutal. In the gutters near 7 Dials and Shoreditch, women stood in ragged dresses, their skin purpled by cold. They did not have warm rooms or velvet curtains. They had alleyways, stairwells, and stables. Their clients paid pennies. Some paid with rotgut gin or half a loaf of bread. These women were not called courtesans or companions. They were called worse. Many were barely adults, some barely girls. They were chased by hunger, by violence, by disease. And yet, even here, they formed communities. They watched each other's backs, passed on names of dangerous men, shared blankets and bruises, and when one of them vanished, the others remembered. But the city did not. To London, they were shadows, barely noticed until the wind turned and someone found a body. Clerkenwell, in particular, held a strange mix of vice and discretion. A short walk from proper gentlemen's clubs and churches, it housed some of the most discreet brothels in the city. These catered to the well-dressed. Inside, the girls wore silk and spoke with affected accents. French words were used to make things sound less dirty. Clients were served wine and asked what music they preferred. The illusion was important. It made everyone feel civilized. But behind the decorum, the mechanics were the same. A transaction, a performance, a silence. The women here were taught to observe, to flatter, to never reveal too much. They knew when to cry and when to laugh. They knew how to disappear into a character. Many never spoke their real names again. Identity, like chastity, was a luxury long abandoned. Police were not blind to the trade. They knew where the brothels were. Some officers were frequent visitors. Others collected regular bribes. Raids were rare and often announced in advance. When they did come, it was more for show than justice. Women would be paraded before a magistrate, fined, and released back to the streets. No man was ever punished. The law was written by the same hands that frequented the dens. The illusion of order had to be maintained. Moral panic sold newspapers, but real change threatened too much power. So the cycle repeated. Arrest, release, repeat. Some girls vanished into prison, others into the Thames. Many simply aged out and became madams themselves or beggars or corpses. The city did not care, as long as the surface remained clean. There were, however, exceptions. Hidden within this world of pain and compromise were women who carved out empires. One owned a network of establishments so vast it rivaled any legitimate business. She employed spies, maids, enforcers. She knew who to call to make a problem disappear. Another woman used her earnings to fund shelters for abandoned children, all while maintaining 3 brothels under false names. These women were not saints, but they were survivors. They played the game better than the men who thought they controlled them. They knew the city's pulse, its weaknesses, its desires, and they knew how to bend them to their will. These women did not walk the streets. They owned them, and their names were spoken only in whispers. Clients came from every walk of life. Dockhands with rough hands and trembling voices. Clerks who recited poetry they never wrote. Soldiers haunted by things they couldn't forget. And yes, lords who wore silk gloves and carried cologne. All seeking something, not always sex, sometimes comfort, sometimes cruelty. The brothel reflected the client's needs like a mirror, distorted but revealing. The women learned to read the signs. A nervous laugh, a glance too long, a silence too heavy. They adjusted, adapted, became what was needed, then shed the role like a snake's skin once the door closed. Each night, 100 performances. Each morning, 100 regrets. There was also coded language that passed from woman to woman, from brothel to brothel. Words that marked danger. Men who paid but never left quietly. Ones with odd requests. Ones who lied. Some brothels had signals built into the architecture. A lamp that blinked 3 times, a bell beneath the floorboard, a hole in the wall just wide enough for a knife. Protection was never promised. It had to be built, enforced, remembered. The streets had no sympathy, only stories, and the women who survived the longest were the ones who knew how to listen to them. In the daylight, these places vanished. The curtains closed, the music stopped, the signs were hidden. The same buildings that pulsed with life the night before stood silent and still, as if nothing had happened. Respectable men walked past, never looking twice. The women retreated to their corners, their bruises covered, their smiles rehearsed again. It was a vanishing act, a magic trick perfected by necessity. But when night returned, so did the life. The shadows returned to their stages. The city sighed, and the game began again. In the end, it wasn't just a trade of flesh. It was a mirror of Victorian London itself, polished on the outside, rotten beneath, and always hiding something behind the curtain. Chapter 3: Gentlemen in Disguise, the Secret World of Victorian Queerness. In the gaslit shadows of Victorian London, there existed a world wrapped in silence. It was not marked on any map, nor acknowledged in polite conversation. But behind locked doors and behind drawn curtains, there thrived a community living in contradiction. Hidden, punished, but enduring. These were the men and women whose desires were forbidden by law and religion alike. To be different in love or identity meant risking everything. Your reputation, your freedom, even your life. And yet, within the heart of the most repressive empire in the world, a secret resistance bloomed. It was not a rebellion of fire and banners. It was one of quiet glances, secret handshakes, coded letters, and rooms where masks came off, where the truth, if only for a moment, was safe. This was the queer underworld of Victorian London, a realm that survived through secrecy and daring, and where each night was a risk disguised as a celebration. It began in places no one would suspect. A tailor's shop that stayed open too late. A bookseller in Bloomsbury with an unusually quiet back room. A music hall that hosted private parties once the crowd had gone. In these spaces, the coded world unfolded. Men who lived rigidly public lives, bankers, barristers, even clergy, shed their daytime personas. With wigs, gowns, powdered faces, and names they never used in daylight, they transformed into someone else. Some dressed in full drag, not as a joke, but as a release. Others simply sat quietly, holding hands with someone they could never acknowledge beyond those walls. There were no cameras, no records, just memory and breath. They danced, drank, laughed, but they never forgot the risk. A knock at the wrong time could mean prison, exposure, ruin, and yet they came back, because to hide forever was its own kind of death. At the center of this world were the cross-dressing clubs. Not all were underground. Some masqueraded as theatrical societies, others as poetry circles. But everyone involved knew what they truly were. Membership was tightly controlled. A single slip, a loose tongue, could bring everything crashing down. Inside, roles reversed, power shifted. Men became women, and women, those brave enough to attend, defied every rule of what femininity meant. These were not just places of pleasure. They were havens of identity. For a few precious hours, people existed as they truly were. No disguises, no lies, only dangerous honesty. The thrill was not just in the taboo. It was in the freedom, in the shared knowledge that here, finally, they were not alone. Not all could access such havens. Many lived in isolation, crafting double lives with surgical precision. By day, they played the roles assigned to them. They married, they had children, they attended church. But by night, in the unlit corners of parks or alleys, they sought stolen moments. A brush of a hand, a whispered meeting. These encounters were brief, raw, and filled with fear. The threat of discovery loomed constantly. London's public parks, especially Hyde Park and Lincoln's Inn Fields, became sites of clandestine rendezvous. Policemen patrolled them heavily, not to protect but to entrap. Sting operations were common. Undercover officers posed as willing participants, only to arrest those who responded. Trials followed, reputations were destroyed, families disowned. And still, the meetings continued, because even a moment of real connection was worth the risk. Despite the danger, love still grew in the margins. Letters were exchanged in coded language, often passed through intermediaries or hidden within books. Flowers carried meanings, pansies for thought, green carnations for recognition, a handkerchief left in a particular pattern. These became symbols of belonging, messages in plain sight, invisible to the uninitiated. The community had its own language, forged from necessity. To be seen by another like you, to be recognized without a word, was a lifeline. Entire friendships and romances bloomed within the shadows. Some lasted months, others years. Few were ever public, but they were no less real. In the eyes of the law, they were crimes. In the hearts of those who lived them, they were salvation. The punishments were cruel. Under Section 11 of the Criminal Law Amendment Act, even suspicion could ruin a man. Imprisonment was just the beginning. The press would seize the story, splashing names across headlines. Employers would sever ties. Friends would vanish. Families would pretend not to know. Some were sent to mental institutions labeled as deviant. Others took their own lives. And yet, amid this horror, some fought back, not with fists, but with resilience. They refused to disappear. They rebuilt in new cities under new names. They found each other again. Their lives became legends whispered through the network. Their courage, a quiet spark in the dark. One of the most infamous stories of the era, whispered long before any scandal made it to court, involved a nobleman who lived a double life for over a decade. Known by a different name in the club circles of Soho, he hosted lavish secret parties where rules dissolved. His downfall came not from betrayal, but from a nosy journalist. Within weeks, his title was stripped, his estate seized, and his name became poison. He fled to the continent, but even in exile, he found others like him. He began sending coded letters back to London, warning others of impending raids, corrupt officials, and new methods of disguise. He became a ghost in the network, a warning and a guide. His legacy, never written down, lived in the habits of those who followed, more careful, more secretive, more free. These gatherings were not limited to men. Women, too, claimed spaces in the margins. Some dressed as men to walk the streets without fear, adopting male identities full-time. They worked in roles forbidden to women. Some fell in love with other women and forged households of their own, calling themselves sisters or roommates to avoid scrutiny. Others passed as male completely, living entire lives undetected. For them, the disguise was not a game. It was a doorway to freedom. They shared their own networks, often linked to the suffragette movement or artistic circles. These women were fearless, cunning, and fiercely protective of one another. Their stories rarely made the news, but their bravery rippled through generations. Art, theater, and literature offered another refuge. Writers smuggled their truth into metaphors. Painters captured forbidden desire in glances and shadows. Plays held double meanings, understood only by those who knew what to look for. The stage became a sanctuary. Performers, many of them queer, found acceptance in roles that blurred gender. Audiences applauded without realizing they were witnessing confessions. In this way, truth found its way into the public eye, hidden in spectacle. It was risky, censorship loomed constantly. But art has always been the language of those who cannot speak openly. And in Victorian London, it was a lifeline. Beneath all of this, there were quiet efforts to build something more. Not just escape, but safety. A few brave souls began to archive letters, stories, and artifacts. Not for fame, but for memory. They believed that one day someone would want to know the truth. They stored boxes in cellars, wrote diaries in invisible ink, buried truths beneath floorboards. Some of these have been uncovered in recent decades. Most remain lost, but the intention matters. Even in the harshest repression, the desire to be remembered persisted. To say, we were here, we existed, we mattered. In a world built to erase them, that was a radical act. As the chapter of Victorian queerness unfolds, one truth becomes clear. It was not defined by tragedy, though tragedy was common. It was defined by courage. The courage to dance in disguise, to love in whispers, to exist without permission. The queer community of Victorian London did not wait for permission to live. They carved out a world in the shadows and filled it with beauty, risk, and defiance. And just as they feared, the law did eventually come for them. Not all escaped, some were betrayed, some were exposed. But many endured, scattering like sparks in the dark, lighting new fires wherever they landed. And somewhere, far from the public eye, the next secret gathering was already beginning. The knock had been given. The door had been opened. The night belonged to them again. Chapter 4: Smoke and Euphoria, the Rise of Opium and Drug Culture. The night air in Limehouse was always thick, but on certain corners, it carried more than fog and coal smoke. A sweeter, more haunting scent drifted from alleyway doors barely ajar. Inside, behind beaded curtains and oil paper lanterns, entire worlds bloomed from a single pipe. These opium dens did not shout their presence. They whispered, luring the desperate and the dreaming alike. Sailors who had tasted the drug in China returned to London craving that same drifting euphoria. They taught the practice to dockside innkeepers, who passed it along to local underworlds. It spread like ink in water, quiet, dark, and irreversible. While Parliament debated morality and empire, the city below was succumbing to a new empire, the empire of the mind. Addiction did not discriminate. Whether you wore lace gloves or coal-stained cuffs, the pipe welcomed all. And in Limehouse, the people whose soul escape knew the difference between relief and ruin was only a few inhalations away. Beneath the groaning ceiling beams of a Limehouse boarding house, a young woman named Elsie lay on a mat, watching smoke twist above her. Her baby slept in the corner, swaddled in old curtains. The opium she bought was cheap, watered down with ash and lye, but she didn't care. Took her somewhere else, even if just for an hour. Elsie had once been a laundry girl, scrubbing the linen of men she never met. When her wages stopped, the drug remained. For her, it was both poison and protection. In the adjoining room, a poet with ink-stained hands coughed between dreamy murmurs. He had been published once, long ago, but now he scribbled fevered dreams into old newspapers. In opium's embrace, class dissolved. A waif and a writer could chase the same dragon. It was not just a drug. It was an equalizer, a destroyer, and for many, an only friend. By night, opium moved through the city like a hidden current. It flowed from the docks, concealed in spice shipments and tea chests, and was funneled through small East End shops run by immigrants who were both vilified and relied upon. The press painted them as villains, But the truth was far murkier. Many were survivors of famine and empire, forced to become both merchants and scapegoats. They served a clientele that denied them by day but begged them by night. London's craving birthed a whole ecosystem. Smugglers, mixers, lookouts, and whisper men who delivered to parlors in Mayfair with silk-wrapped pipes. A barmaid could morph into a dealer by moonlight. An errand boy might carry nightmares in his satchel. The city became a living paradox, outwardly proper, inwardly corrupted. And all the while, the drug traveled unchecked, hidden in plain sight, invisible in teacups and tinctures until it devoured the very soul of its host. Gin palaces, with their mirrored walls and glowing chandeliers, seemed respectable enough at a glance. But deeper within, behind locked cellars or upstairs rooms, another commerce took place. Laudanum, a mixture of alcohol and opium, was legal, sold openly as a cure for everything from coughs to heartbreak. Housewives drank it by the spoonful. Doctors prescribed it without hesitation. And writers romanticized it as fuel for genius. But beneath the surface of this golden liquid lay a silent scream. Once begun, the thirst never stopped. In Holborn, a clerk who lost his wife to consumption spent his inheritance on laudanum, vanishing into the folds of oblivion. By the time he was found, he had written 30 love letters to a ghost. The city wrapped these stories in euphemism, calling them melancholy or madness, but the truth was always in the bottle. London drank to forget, and laudanum made forgetting an art form. Some nights, the fog in London was not natural. It crawled from open windows and cellar doors where opium smoked the ceilings. In poorer wards, neighbors learned to recognize the scent. Sweet, foreign, and sinister. It meant someone had found a way out, if only for an hour. But in the homes of the wealthy, the same scent was masked with perfume and decanters. The wife of a retired general kept a carved ivory pipe hidden inside her piano bench. Her guests never knew. Her servants did. They watched as her laughter grew louder, then quieter, then disappeared altogether. The drug took differently to each victim. Some became violent, others faded into stillness. But all shared the same descent, a gentle slide into dependency. Victorian London was a city built on appearances, and opium was the secret that let them all crumble quietly, behind drawn curtains, under flickering gaslight, where no one dared to look. By the Thames, barges carried more than timber and coal. Some shipments were soaked in secrets, false bottoms in crates, hollow lanterns packed with dried poppy resin. A corrupt inspector could be bought for a pint or a favor. Once ashore, the merchandise moved through a network of silent couriers. In one case, a young boy named Jonah was caught with a belt lined with opium pellets. He never named the man who paid him. He vanished soon after. The city did not mourn. These children were the invisible veins of the drug trade, ferrying poison under their coats, their innocence used as camouflage. Their names were rarely known, but their fates were written in alley chalk and missing persons lists. Opium did not care who carried it, it only needed to arrive. And so the river that once brought life to London now delivered its slow, fragrant death through shadowy channels few dared trace. Limehouse, once known for its shipping yards and sailor saloons, became something else entirely after dark. Here, opium dens sat cheek by jowl with gambling houses and fortune readers. An entire sub-economy thrived on altered states. For some, it was a means of power. For others, it was the only way to numb the world. A woman named May, widowed young, managed a den hidden behind a tea house. She was not a villain, nor a saint. She knew every regular's vice, every heartbreak they carried like coins in a pocket. She also knew withdrawal could turn men into monsters. Some begged, some cursed, and others simply crumbled. She buried 3 in one winter. No one asked questions. She poured tea, offered pipes, and kept a pistol nearby. Her silence was part of the service. In May's den, the city's grief wore many faces. Lost children, failed painters, ruined lords, and all paid the same price for a moment's escape. In Clerkenwell, a failed chemist turned alchemist began selling tinctures he claimed could restore youth. He wore a white coat, kept a dog-eared book of formulas, and smiled too widely. His true concoctions were variations of opium, some spiked with belladonna, others with turpentine. They dulled pain, yes, but they also stole weeks, then months, then years from those who used them. A retired seamstress named Nora took the tincture to ease her aching joints. She ended up forgetting her own name. Her room became a mausoleum of teacups and broken clocks. No one blamed the chemist. He disappeared one day, leaving behind empty vials and 3 unclaimed bodies. These stories never made the headlines. They circulated by whispers, cautionary tales told in soup lines and sickbeds. Victorian London didn't need monsters from fiction. It had real ones, quiet ones, who looked like doctors and walked like gentlemen, dealing dreams that slowly devoured their host. Even the morgues began to notice. Coroners found organs shriveled like dried fruit, lungs soaked in tar, and hearts that simply stopped. But the cause of death often read exhaustion or natural causes. No one wanted to admit the epidemic that was slithering beneath the empire's polished veneer. The press flirted with the topic, but rarely named it. The elite feared panic, the government feared scandal, and the public feared losing their means of escape. Addiction did not look like a villain. It looked like your neighbor, your teacher, your wife. It lived in the margins and behind the eyes. Laudanum bottles were tucked into corsets, opium pellets sewn into coat hems. London had become a city half asleep, dreaming dark dreams while pretending to be awake. Every night, thousands slipped into chemical slumber. Some never returned, but no bells tolled for them. Only silence and the faint, lingering perfume of smoke and euphoria. In this twilight world, love often bloomed beside decay. Couples shared pipes as if they were wine, breathing each other's ghosts into the air. Artists sketched visions they could not explain. Prostitutes took laudanum to endure their nights, unaware the remedy was a chain. Even the music of London changed. Taverns once filled with shouting grew quieter, soaked in dreamy chords and murmured verses. The drug culture did not explode, it seeped, reshaping culture from the inside. Theater performers praised it as inspiration. Housewives swore by its relief. Clerics condemned it from pulpits, even as they used it to sleep. The hypocrisy was endless. What bound them all together was the lie they told themselves, that they were still in control. But opium cared nothing for stories. It only wanted entry, and once inside, it waited patiently, coiling softly, until it replaced the soul it had soothed with a hollow that no dream could fill. The city's brightest minds often flirted with the darkness. Writers and scholars used laudanum not just for pain, but for revelation. They claimed it opened doors to other realities, let them glimpse truths too painful for daylight. And maybe it did, but many of them paid a steep toll. A philosopher once hailed it as the key to the human condition, only to be found days later in a canal, clasping a bottle with his final notes smeared by water. He was not mourned publicly. Instead, his ideas were dissected, his death sanitized. London learned to consume its own tragedy neatly, like slicing bread. No one acknowledged the growing cemetery beneath the glamour. The city wore veils of denial, always pretending the nightmare was someone else's. But every echo of coughs in narrow stairwells, every pair of eyes half closed behind shop counters, told the same story. London was addicted not just to opium but to forgetting. As night falls once more over London, the smoky lamps flicker and the wind carries secrets down cobbled lanes. In Limehouse, a new girl arrives at May's door, shaking with cold and grief. She does not speak. May does not ask. She simply opens the door and steps aside. Somewhere nearby, a poet leans against a wall, counting coins for a final escape. In Clerkenwell, an aristocrat in a velvet coat lifts a cup that glitters darkly. And by the river, crates unload beneath the full moon, carrying poison wrapped in silk. The city breathes in slow and heavy. The night has begun again, and with it, the same cycle unfolds. Pain, relief, ruin. London is wide awake, yet dreaming still. A city of shadows and smoke, of whispered longings and vanishing souls, where euphoria comes at a cost too high to name. And still the pipe is passed. Still the dream continues. Chapter 5. The Ragged Rites, Black Magic, Fortune Tellers, and Occult Societies. By the flicker of a single candle, the air inside the small back room on Whitechapel Road turned thick with whispers and smoke. Shadows moved independently of bodies, curling along the faded wallpaper like spirits eager to speak. These rooms, tucked behind pawn shops, chemist stalls, and cheap dressmakers, hosted what the elite called superstition, but what the desperate called salvation. The spiritual fever that gripped London had little to do with religion. It pulsed instead through the occult underworld, where rituals promised answers to pain, poverty, and heartbreak. Women in tattered shawls traded their last coin to hear the future in tea leaves. Men with blood on their hands sought absolution not in churches, but in underground seances led by self-made mystics. In the alleys of the forgotten, the dead were never silent. They waited, just beyond the veil, their voices summoned by trembling hands, and sometimes by something far older than grief. Among these shadows was a girl named Elsie, an orphan of the cholera pits, who first glimpsed her strange talent in a fever dream. Barely 12 and half-starved, she began to speak names she'd never heard, secrets she could not have known. Word spread quickly, and soon strangers came knocking, some with fear in their eyes, others with obsession. A local widow paid her in bread to speak with her drowned son. A dock worker begged for numbers whispered by the dead. With each vision, Elsie felt her bones weaken and her dreams twist. The city had found its new clairvoyant, but it never asked what it cost her. At night, after the last visitor left, she would steal away into the woods past Mile End, drawn by an ancient rhythm pulsing through the soil. There, beneath the ivy-covered stones, an older truth awaited. a ritual circle long forgotten by polite society. The secret covens of London were not just myths whispered by the drunk and deranged. They existed behind the facades of dry goods shops, under the rattle of train bridges, and in the thick mist of Hampstead Heath. Composed of seamstresses, butchers, midwives, and laborers, these societies preserved rites older than empire. They danced barefoot by moonlight, smeared ash across their faces, and whispered names too ancient for prayer. Unlike the spiritualists of parlors and velvet, these cults did not seek comfort. They craved power. Nature, pain, birth, and decay were their scriptures. For many, the church had failed to answer the city's cruelty, but the blood-soaked earth never lied, and those who joined found both purpose and peril in its embrace. Some vanished without word. Others returned changed, mute, haunted, or hungry for something words could never explain. Meanwhile, the spiritualist movement among the upper classes surged with elegance and theater. Parlors in Mayfair held candlelit gatherings where polished mediums, mostly women, conducted seances dressed in silk and lace. Guests sipped sherry as tables trembled, veils floated, and phantom voices echoed from behind velvet curtains. It was a fashionable rebellion against rigid science and stricter theology. Yet behind the spectacle, darker currents flowed. Some mediums were charlatans skilled in trickery, but a few were real, frighteningly so. They did not summon spirits, but unleashed them. What began as entertainment occasionally ended in madness, with guests screaming, fainting, or vomiting black bile no doctor could explain. And always those guests returned. They were addicted not to belief, but to the sensation of touching the abyss. Elsie's rise among the rich came suddenly. A curious countess with a taste for the exotic invited her into a marble home on Belgrave Square. There, amid mirrors and gold, the orphan girl summoned not only the countess's dead sister, but the house's own ghost, a long-forgotten servant girl whose bones had been sealed in the wall. Word spread like fire. Suddenly, Elsie was whisked from the gutters to parlors filled with lace, champagne, and terrified curiosity. She did not belong, but she became indispensable. Her eyes, once dull with hunger, now shimmered with something feral. She began to speak in tongues no one taught her. Sometimes, during sessions, her voice changed pitch, her pupils widened, and her limbs moved like a puppet. The rich watched in horror and awe, but none dared ask what possessed the girl, or if she still remained within. Yet while Elsie gained fame, she never abandoned the coven in the woods. Beneath the full moon, she danced with the forgotten, those who still bled for prophecy, not profit. Here the rituals were raw and real. Blood was spilled on stones, not velvet cushions. Bones were buried with chants, not applause. One night, during a winter solstice rite, a new figure joined the circle, hooded, silent, bearing the sigil of an extinct order once accused of witchcraft by the crown. They did not speak, but pressed a bone knife into Elsie's palm. From that moment, she became not just a seer, but a vessel. Her visions turned violent, her clients wept and screamed, and a few never returned home. Rumors began to swirl. Was she blessed or cursed? By 1885, London's police began receiving anonymous letters. Reports of satanic rites, dead animals found in ritual poses, and children claiming dreams of faceless women dancing in graveyards. Some claimed a coven was attempting to open something, a gate, a portal, a truth hidden since Druid times. Newspapers mocked it all, but detectives assigned to the case quickly grew silent or requested reassignment. One inspector vanished after attending a séance incognito. His coat was later found near Highgate Cemetery, soaked in something warm and red. The girl known as Elsie was questioned, but her benefactors ensured silence. A judge even declared her a national treasure. Behind closed doors, however, private investigators and whispering priests took an interest. The church feared what it could not control. And this girl, they said, was no longer just a medium. She was a beacon, and something ancient was watching. Among the aristocracy, occult societies took on stranger forms. Secret dining clubs that worshipped forgotten gods. Poetry salons that devolved into blood rituals. Even Parliament had its ghosts, quite literally, in the minds of some members. A secret society known as the Order of the Raven met in abandoned catacombs beneath the Thames, its members wearing masks shaped like plague birds. Their mission: to keep ancient powers asleep. But whispers claimed the order had splintered, and some now sought to awaken what their ancestors once buried. It was said they were tracking Elsie, not to stop her, but to use her as a conduit. She, after all, had seen what lay beyond the veil, and some men believed dominion over such things would grant them more than power. It would grant them immortality. Back in Whitechapel, where Elsie's story had begun, strange flowers began growing in places untouched by sun. Children whispered her name as if it were a spell. A fever of belief gripped the poor. They lit candles in her image, left offerings at the door where she once slept, and claimed she appeared in dreams offering riddles and warnings. One woman said her dead child had returned, if only for a night, smiling in silence. Another claimed her cancer vanished after praying to the girl in the dark. The line between saint and sorceress blurred, and so the city, ever hungry for legends, embraced another. But this legend had teeth, and while some found hope in the darkness, others found madness. The spiritual hysteria reached its peak when a séance in Kensington ended with 3 deaths. No poison, no marks, only frozen expressions of horror. One survivor, trembling and incoherent, claimed the group had called something not from the spirit world, but from below. Something that spoke in a voice made of insects and wind. That night, Elsie vanished. Her benefactors denied knowledge. The coven in the woods dispersed. The candlelit rooms went silent. And yet, the city never quite recovered. Gas lamps flickered more often. Dreams turned strange. And a persistent whisper returned to Whitechapel's fog, sometimes mistaken for wind, sometimes for laughter, always just behind your shoulder. To this day, some say London never truly left the age of magic. It simply learned to hide it better. Behind glass towers and subway tunnels, beneath pubs and Parliament, the rites continue. A new girl will be born. A new whisper will rise. And when the veil thins again, it will not be God who answers. It will be the old things, the ones we tried to forget, but who never forgot us. Victorian London may be long gone, but its secrets are still breathing, and they know your name. Chapter 6. Blood and Guts, the Butchers, Body Snatchers, and Crime Lords. At the edge of Smithfield Market, where the air never lost the scent of blood, the butchers' cleavers rang like bells at dawn. By day it was trade, By night, it was something else. The shadows behind the stalls held secrets older than the law. The cobbled stones were slick, not just from animal blood, but from the silent economy that fed London's underbelly. Meat wasn't the only flesh moved here, and not all who were cut came from farms. When the fog thickened and the gas lamps dimmed, the line between butcher and killer vanished. In the alleys beyond the meat stalls, men in stained aprons took gold for organs, not sausages. They knew the weight of a body in silence. They knew what parts brought the best price. In a world where hunger ruled, ethics rotted quicker than meat. And London's night world fed on more than livestock. It fed on the forgotten. Not far from those butcher shops, another trade crept through the graveyards. Body snatchers, also known as resurrection men, made their living in silence. Shovels plunged into the earth at midnight. Coffins cracked like cheap crates. Fresh corpses were hauled from soil and carted off to buyers with medical degrees and godless eyes. Hospitals and anatomy schools needed practice material, but the law forbade it. So they turned to the shadows. These grave robbers worked in pairs, sometimes with insiders at cemeteries who looked the other way for a share. A healthy male corpse fetched the most. Women's bodies brought less and less pregnant. Children, tragically, were in demand for private collectors and deranged physicians alike. The work was fast, brutal, and often desecrating. But the pay was good, and in the slums, that was enough to make any sin tolerable. Even the one that woke screaming from the dirt. The police, of course, knew about these trades, but they walked a fine line. With enough bribes, a constable could go blind and deaf for an hour. Some even took commissions. The crown wanted order, but not at the expense of keeping surgeons from their scalpels. Unofficially, the body trade was necessary. Officially, it never existed. That duality ran deep in London's veins. Crime lords took full advantage. They didn't just organize thieves, they ran industries. One family controlled the trade in stolen corpses from Camden to Clapham. Another operated a fleet of meat carts that delivered more than pork. These weren't gutter criminals. They wore suits, attended church, and funded local elections. Their power was not won with blood alone. It was cemented with silence. Every corpse bought them another favor. Every missing person whispered another secret. And once you worked for them, you never left. Not alive, at least. Behind these criminal empires were networks that extended across the Thames and into Parliament. Criminals learned long ago that darkness was only useful if it reached into the light. Some lords owned the butcher shops. Some surgeons paid double for discretion. Even the rail lines were used. Coffins packed with illegal goods moved through stations without question. The crime lords controlled not just streets, but systems. They placed their own in police ranks. They owned judges. When trials happened, they always ended in vanishing witnesses or missing evidence. Their power lay not in visibility, but in invisibility. They were ghosts wearing flesh. And in a city as bloated with contradictions as Victorian London, they thrived. The more people refused to look, the stronger they became. And no one looked harder away than the upper class, who dined on veal even as their doctor carved through human ribs in a private backroom. One story told in hushed tones was that of a child found butchered in Spitalfields, her organs removed with surgical precision. No blood trail, no forced entry, just the body displayed as if dissected for a textbook. The press never ran the story. The family vanished a week later. A coroner's assistant, who attempted to report it, disappeared. Years later, whispers said the girl had been sold to a gentleman scientist for study and returned posthumously for a final show. This wasn't an isolated case. Dozens of such tales existed, passed from mouth to mouth in gin houses and coal yards. They couldn't all be true, but not all needed to be false. In a world where human life had a price, nightmares were often receipts. The criminal families who ran this hidden empire weren't gangs in the modern sense. They were dynasties. Their names were rarely known beyond the darkest pubs. They operated through codes, loyalty pacts, and rituals more ancient than profit. A child born into one of these families was marked from the first breath. They were taught which doors to knock, which names to whisper, and which ones to never say aloud. They practiced silence like religion. Their weddings were business deals, their funerals reminders. A body snatched from a graveyard was not theft, it was tax. A stolen liver, not contraband, it was inventory. By the time they were 12, their children could strip a cadaver faster than a doctor. Their power didn't lie in bullets. It lay in knowledge. Who owed what, who paid in silence, and who buried the truth. Among these families, the most feared was the Holloway Syndicate. They did not tolerate failure. Their reputation was built on precision. If a deal was broken, they didn't send threats, they sent parts. A butchered hand on a doorstep, a tongue pinned to a pub wall. They trafficked in flesh, yes, but also in fear. Their enforcers wore gloves made from tanned skin. Their carriages had false bottoms lined with ice. No one saw them unless they wanted to be seen. And when they wanted you to see them, it was already too late. Their network reached from the morgue to the mansion. One whisper said they had a permanent contract with a hospital that claimed to cure madness by delivering the bodies of the incurable straight into the syndicate's hands. The truth, unproven. But the missing census records from that asylum told another story. For the lower class, this criminal order was both curse and necessity. In the East End, where starvation lived in every brick, the syndicate provided work. Boys became runners. Girls cleaned bone saws. Old men served as lookouts. It was dangerous, yes, but it paid more than a factory ever could. And in a world where death came cheap, at least the syndicate gave it meaning. Some even claimed the syndicate protected them, kept rival gangs out, enforced rules. No harm to children without approval. No killing without purpose. It was twisted morality born from blood, but morality nonetheless. Those who crossed the line disappeared, and those who obeyed lived. Not well, not clean, but lived. Sometimes rival factions erupted into war. Whole alleyways became battlegrounds of blades and blunt iron. Police reports vanished, coroners were bribed, and yet the bodies were real. 1 year, 27 corpses washed up in the Thames, all with the same throat incision. It was called the Mute War, a war with no headlines, no public trial, and no winner. Only survivors. The public never knew, but the shadow class remembered. They whispered about it while gutting rats or sweeping ash from a brothel floor. They remembered the fear. They remembered the silence. And beneath it all, the butchers still chopped, the grave robbers still dug, and the crime lords still sat in their smoke-filled rooms counting gold soaked in blood. The city, for all its cathedrals and courts, ran on this hidden economy. It wasn't the queen who kept order, it was fear. And while daylight told one story, Night told another, one where every lantern glow meant danger, where every shadow whispered a deal, and where the line between survival and damnation was drawn with a knife, then wiped clean with a cloth soaked in gin. Victorian London survived because its underworld thrived. It didn't just coexist with crime, it depended on it. Every legal institution rested on a pile of bones someone else had buried. Every polite dinner was paid for with blood someone else had shed. The crime lords weren't anomalies, they were pillars. They were the night's true aristocracy, and their reign, hidden beneath layers of soot and civility, outlasted many empires. Because in the end, when the law faltered and the clergy grew silent, only one truth remained. Flesh was currency, and in the shadow class, everyone had a price. Chapter 7: Masquerades and Masks, the Ballrooms of the Forgotten. When the final bell of midnight rang through the cobbled streets, there were places in London where time slipped off its leash. Beneath the surface of coal-stained walls and soot-covered windows, doors opened to an entirely different world. A world made not of reality, but of fantasy. These were the ballrooms of the forgotten, tucked beneath old warehouses or hidden behind the back rooms of puppet theaters. Lanterns swung from rafters overhead, casting glimmers on faces painted in gold, silver, and shadow. No one used real names. No one asked questions. Here, chimney sweeps danced with dukes, actresses curtsied to beggars, and everyone wore a mask. Some velvet, some porcelain, some merely made of bold lies whispered in candlelight. There was freedom in this illusion. In a world obsessed with class, these spaces offered something forbidden. Equality, even if only until dawn. For one night, the rules broke like old glass, and no one cared to pick up the pieces. One of the grandest of these gatherings unfolded behind a derelict lace factory near Clerkenwell, known only by a whisper, the Mirror Room. Entry was by invitation, coded and passed through match girls, delivery boys, or the rare sympathetic aristocrat with a penchant for theatrical rebellion. Guests arrived disguised as kings, clowns, or beasts, their true identities erased beneath layers of silk and paint. Inside, the ballroom seemed to pulse with its own rhythm. Musicians, often pickpockets by day, transformed their grimy violins into tools of enchantment. The scent of spiced gin and honeyed perfume clung to the air, masking the truth of who had eaten that day and who had not. By the time the waltz began, reality itself felt like another costume hung on the rack. And in the corners, deals were struck. Romantic, political, criminal, all swaying to the tempo of escape. What made these events more than escapism was how deeply they threatened the rigid structure of Victorian society. The poor did not simply imitate the elite. They reinvented what elegance meant. Lace collars made from old curtains, gowns stitched from charity shop remnants, paper crowns worn with defiant grace. The aristocrats who dared to attend came not just for thrills, but to taste a life stripped of suffocating expectations. Daughters of merchant families shed their corsets for flowing tunics, and sons of barristers kissed factory boys beneath the shadows of stage curtains. It was unspoken, but known, within these rooms the monarchy of appearance collapsed. Truth lay not in wealth or title, but in how well one could dance with a stranger and pretend the world outside did not exist. The performers who ran these masquerades were a world unto themselves. Many were former music hall singers, illusionists, or exiled actors shunned from polite society. They ruled with painted faces and theatrical flourish. One legendary host, a towering figure who called herself Madame Serafina, was said to have once been the mistress of a nobleman before vanishing into the fog. Now she conducted each masquerade like a conductor with a baton made of mischief. Her entourage, known as the Orphans of Midnight, included pickpockets, dwarves, and a mute violinist whose playing could bring hardened thieves to tears. They ensured the ballrooms were safe, if not legal. In a city where hunger gnawed and morals suffocated, these artists offered transcendence, one pirouette at a time. Behind the curtains, of course, lay secrets darker than the performances themselves. Many of these balls served as fronts for clandestine meetings. Revolutionaries whispered plans beside wine goblets. Smugglers exchanged ledgers behind costume closets. Some ballrooms hosted auctions of things no law dared to name: forgery services, stolen books, even revenge for hire. The joy on the dance floor always held an edge of risk, like stepping into a dream balanced over a pit. And yet no one stayed away, because here danger and wonder walked hand in hand. To dance was to defy everything the daylight demanded, and for some that was worth any price. Not everyone who attended was poor or rebellious. Some guests were highly placed members of the upper crust, sneaking in under the guise of anonymity. These included politicians, clergymen, even members of the Queen's own household. By night, they watched shadow plays performed by destitute children with eyes too old for their age. They clapped as beggars sang operas in perfect Italian. They wept at pantomimes that mirrored their own empty lives of routine and reputation. What they found in those halls was not scandal, but truth. Raw, bloody, beautiful truth painted on a stage of broken dreams. It was, ironically, the only place they ever felt real. The cost of these masquerades was not paid in coins. It was paid in secrecy, in silence, in risk. Raids happened, especially when the police were tipped off by rival crime families or moral crusaders. Those caught were beaten, jailed, or simply disappeared. One night, the mirror room was raided, and Madame Serafina vanished forever. Some said she fled to France. Others whispered she was buried in the Thames. The Orphans of Midnight scattered like stardust across alleys and attics, taking with them the final breath of a dream that could not survive daylight. But other halls soon rose in her place, because the hunger for freedom cannot be buried, not even by fear. Behind the facade of rebellion, a shocking truth simmered. One of Victorian London's most respected institutions secretly bankrolled these masquerades. It was not a cabal of artists, nor a liberal circle of poets, but a well-known philanthropic society often praised in the papers for its charity work. Through silent donations, they kept the music playing, because its founders believed that these underground celebrations kept the poor pacified. Better for them to wear masks and waltz than to riot in the streets. The very masquerades that promised liberation had, unknowingly, become tools of control, and no one, on stage or off, ever suspected it. This revelation, buried in secret correspondences uncovered long after the era had passed, recasts the entire underground theater of Victorian London. What seemed like resistance may have been permitted indulgence. What felt like power may have been carefully rationed freedom. And yet, within those dance halls, real joy still bloomed. Real love blossomed behind silk masks. Real tears fell during staged tragedies that mirrored personal ones too painful to speak aloud. Even if manipulated, the art was real. The escape was real. And for those who had nothing, even a taste of magic was enough. As the gaslights dimmed and carriages rumbled into mist, the final notes of each masquerade hung in the air like the ghost of laughter. Footsteps echoed on cobblestones, leaving behind a trail of glitter and forgotten dreams. The morning brought harsh light, tight corsets, and hungry mouths to feed. But those who had danced remembered, and sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, they would hum the tune of that last waltz and smile. For a few precious hours, they had been someone else, somewhere else. And no law, no lie, no lash of society could take that away. Today, little remains of the ballrooms of the forgotten. Most were boarded up, demolished, or buried under concrete progress. But dig deep enough in the archives, and their shadows still breathe. A torn mask found in a floorboard, a diary page filled with perfume and longing, a faded ticket with only the word midnight. These relics whisper of a time when the powerless pirouetted in defiance, when art outshone authority, and when the underworld dared to dream in lace and velvet. In the masquerades of the forgotten, Victorian London wore its most honest mask, one shaped not by status, but by desire. The final legacy of these secret societies lies not in the balls themselves, but in what they symbolized. They were sanctuaries in a city of cold logic, temples of transformation in an age of repression. They blurred the lines between servant and master, between performer and judge. And they reminded the world that beneath every soot-stained face, behind every stitched-on smile, there lived a soul longing to be seen, to be heard, to be free, even if just for a night, even if only behind a mask.